I had barely cut the engine when the familiar, sharp voice sliced through the hum of the parking lot. "Seriously? You drove that thing here?" I looked up from the steering wheel and saw my sister, Amber, standing in front of the grand entrance of the Chicago Golf and Country Club. The late afternoon sun caught the shimmer of her champagne-colored dress, the kind you know costs more than your monthly rent, and turned her into a walking advertisement for everything she valued: appearance, status, perfection. She was holding a chilled glass of rosé like it was an extension of her arm, the other hand clutching a designer clutch that probably cost more than my entire outfit. Her perfectly manicured nail pointed at my car, a dark blue Ford Fusion with a few years and a few too many miles under its belt. "You look like you're here to pick up somebody's kids from soccer practice. Did you get lost on the way to your babysitting job?" I could hear the laughter from the veranda behind her, where a small gathering of our extended family was sipping wine and soaking in the late summer breeze. The sound rolled across the parking lot and settled into the pit of my stomach. The funny thing was, I'd heard it all before, maybe not those exact words, but the sentiment. The Fusion, in their eyes, wasn't just a car, it was proof of my alleged failure to keep up. In their world, status was parked in the driveway for everyone to see. Anything less than a European badge on the hood was an open confession of mediocrity. I didn't argue. I didn't tell her that my car was deliberately plain, chosen with purpose. I didn't mention that the worn leather seats and the subtle rattle under the hood had been with me through more classified operations than she could imagine. I didn't tell her that this vehicle, this supposed nanny car, was known in my world as a ghost. It could blend into any suburban street, slip unnoticed past watchful eyes, and give me the one thing my real job required above all else: invisibility. But that wasn't a story I could tell. Not here. Not to her. So I smiled faintly, the way I'd been trained to in far more hostile encounters, and stepped out of the driver's seat. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and expensive cologne drifting from the veranda. My low-heeled shoes crunched on the gravel. Amber looked me over like I was a smudge on a glass door, something that needed to be wiped away before the guests noticed. "Well," she said, lowering her voice but not enough to stop the nearest onlookers from hearing, "you at least try to park it somewhere no one will see it. Maybe behind the kitchen?" It was a subtle dismissal, wrapped in the faux sweetness she'd perfected over the years. To her, this was just another social maneuver to keep the family's image flawless. To me, it was another tally mark on a very long list of slights, an unbroken record of moments where I was reminded that I didn't quite measure up to the golden image she and her husband, Zach, projected. But what Amber didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that this moment was already beginning to set the stage for something far larger. I'd seen this kind of arrogance before, in other contexts, other countries. It always followed the same pattern: overconfidence, underestimation, and eventually, correction. I glanced at my watch, a simple matte black field model I'd worn on more deployments than family dinners. The second hand swept over the face in steady, precise ticks, the way my mind was already beginning to measure the scene, not in emotion, but in variables. From the veranda, I heard my uncle call out a joke about whether my car could make it back home without breaking down. Laughter followed. Amber smirked. My eyes swept the entrance, security camera above the door, blind spot near the hedge, service entrance about 20 feet to the right. My brain was already mapping the layout. Old habits. I gave Amber one last polite smile and said, "Don't worry. You won't even notice I'm here." She took that as submission. I meant it as a promise. Because while she thought the biggest consequence of her jab was me parking next to the dumpsters, She had no idea that she'd just insulted me and my vehicle in front of the one person whose security I'd been quietly sent here to assess. And in my world, a detail like that could change everything. The valet jogged over with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He couldn't have been more than 19, slick hair, crimson tie, a tiny radio clipped to his belt like a badge of rank. He gave my Fusion a slow, theatrical once-over, then shifted his gaze past me as if the car's paint might flake onto his trousers if he looked too long. He said, in a tone that felt like a velvet robe. A member's vehicles are staged near the portico. Guests are routed around the side lot. Around the side lot. The phrase was delivered gently, but it landed like a stamp on my forehead, not one of US. Before I could answer, a club attendant with a clipboard materialized, the way small bureaucracies summon themselves when there's an opportunity to prove relevance. He scanned the list, flipping a page with an audible snap. Name? He asked. I gave him mine. His eyes flitted down, then up, then past me toward the veranda where crystal glasses chimed and laughter spilled over the stone balustrade. He aimed his voice just loud enough for the audience. I'm not seeing that here, so we'll have you park in overflow C, follow the service road past the loading bay. He pointed toward a gap between two hedges where a delivery truck idled, its reverse beeper nagging the afternoon. Amber stepped in like a benevolent queen descending to address a peasant complaint. It's fine, Connor, as she trilled, reading his name from the badge. She's with us. Family. She slipped the last word in like a disclaimer on a commercial, legally accurate, emotionally irrelevant. Then, without lowering her voice, she added for the semicircle of eavesdroppers, can you just tuck it behind the kitchens? Out of sight? A few heads turned. Someone's cufflink flashed. I felt, briefly, like a scuff on the marble. I could have shown them my actual credentials. I could have said the words that make radios squawk and clipboards go blank. But that isn't how you win the quiet wars. You don't drop rank in a lobby to soothe pride. You log the terrain. You collect the tells. You save your ammunition for the objective. Behind the kitchens, I echoed mildly, as if sampling a new flavor. Understood. Amber misread my calm for capitulation, the way she always had. She tilted her head, satisfied, and drifted back toward the veranda, toward Zach, who was mid-gesture in some story meant to impress a city council man. His blazer was the color of new money. The councilman laughed at something that wasn't funny. I put the Fusion in gear and eased away from the portico, following the lane that bent around the manicured hedges. The air smelled like rosemary from the herb garden and fryer oil from the catering bay. The delivery truck's beeper hiccuped to a stop. On my right, a pair of sous chefs in white jackets smoked filtered camels by the service door, exhaling in synchronized indifference. They barely glanced at me. There, in the relative quiet, the heat washed out of my face. What replaced it wasn't the kind of heat that burns. It was something cleaner, colder, like a blade drawn along an oral stone. Precision returned. Breathing evened. I let my eyes sweep the service road, the line of sight to the main gate, the unprotected span between the kitchen loading area and a low stretch of decorative fencing, the set of double doors propped open by a crate of sparkling water. The map in my head started to shade itself in. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. A text from Mom. So happy you came, sweetheart. Amber put so much work into this. Then, because she never could resist smoothing the wrinkles out of reality, please be kind. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. My thumb hovered. I typed, always. Then I deleted it and sent a thumbs up. It said nothing and everything. I found a strip of asphalt behind a row of cedar shrubs and backed in, nose out, a habit that's half professional, half superstition. The Fusion's engine ticked as it cooled. For a moment I sat with both hands on the wheel, feeling the texture of the worn leather against my palms. People think service teaches you to endure. It doesn't. It teaches you to notice, to catalogue, to wait. A golf cart whirred up beside me. The driver, a security supervisor with a sunburned neck and the weary swagger of a man who's broken up 100 wedding fights, leaned over the passenger seat. Overflow C is full, he said. We can squeeze you by the dumpsters if you're quick. Perfect, I replied, and meant it. He blinked, unsure if I was being sarcastic. Big fundraiser tonight, he offered. City folks. Press. We keep the front for the show, you know. I smiled. I know. He tipped his cap and hummed away. I watched him go, then pulled into the shadow of the service bay. A metal door rattled as a dishwasher kicked on. 2 line cooks lugged a tub of ice past my bumper. The hum of the building felt like a heartbeat. I checked my watch again and slid the slim black wallet from my jacket pocket, not the leather one with my driver's license, the other one. Inside, a laminated card with a barcode. I didn't need it today, but just seeing it settled something restless inside me. I locked the Fusion, slipped my keys into the inner pocket where I always keep them, and headed for the small footpath that looped back to the main lawn. As I walked, I heard my name, my childhood nickname, actually, float from the veranda like a paper airplane. Lexi, my cousin called, surprise pitched high. I turned. She jogged down the steps in block heels, breath coming quick. I'm so glad you made it. Amber wasn't sure you'd, you know. She fluttered a hand, meaning fit. I'm here, I said, pleasant as a postcard. She looked past me toward the roofline. Did you see Zach's tent? He had it custom made. The mayor might swing by if the schedule, as she caught herself, suddenly remembering a script. You look great, by the way. Very professional. Kitchen chic, I said dryly. She laughed, relieved to find a safe joke. Come on, you should say hi to Zach before he's mobbed. She started walking without waiting for me to follow. I didn't. I'll catch up, I said. I want to find Mom. Right. Of course. Her smile faltered for half a beat, then reset to its factory settings. She waved and flitted off, her perfume trailing something floral and expensive. I stood at the edge of the lawn a moment longer, taking in the geometry of it, caterers stepping off their marks like dancers, wine bottles replaced at precise intervals, security at the fringe pretending to be bored. On the far side, Amber posed with 2 women in identical dresses, their laughter calibrated to the cameras. A band tuned up under white draping, the sound checking at exactly the moment the light on the lake turned gold. Everything planned. Everything curated. Except what came next. I walked the perimeter, slow enough to be forgettable. I scoped the emergency access along the cart path, the single bollard that would need to be unlocked if a vehicle had to get through in a hurry, the bottleneck by the koi pond where a crowd would compress in an evacuation. I took mental photos and filed them where they live, crisp, retrievable, dispassionate. As I rounded the last corner back toward the veranda stairs, I caught a reflection in the French doors, my own face, composed and unremarkable. Good. Remaining unremarkable is an art form. In a world addicted to spectacle, anonymity is the best armor. From behind the glass, Zach's laugh boomed as he clasped the councilman's shoulder. He didn't see me. He never does until the moment matters. I straightened my jacket and stepped inside the cool, conditioned air of the lobby. The marble floor gleamed. Somewhere down the hall, a radio crackled with a burst of static and a voice I recognized from earlier. The Sunbend supervisor. E-copy. VIP arrival updated. Front entrance remains clear. I looked at the clock over the fireplace. The second hand swept. Steady, merciless. Behind the kitchen, my car waited where no one respectable would park. It made me smile. Some things are best kept out of sight, until the moment they aren't. Families, in theory, are meant to be constellations, each member a star in their own right, shining together to make a whole. Mine was more like a solar system with two blazing suns at the center, my sister Amber and her husband, Zach. Amber had been the golden child since the day she could hold a hairbrush like a microphone and command a living room with a song. She grew into the sort of woman magazine editors loved, polished, photogenic, effortlessly poised in the spotlight. Zach, her perfect match, had carved out his own sphere of influence in Austin's startup scene, armed with a kind of networking skills that could turn a weekend barbecue into a pitch meeting. Together they were a brand, a performance of success. And the rest of the family, my parents, a few cousins, the orbiting friends who wanted to bask in their glow, were the faithful audience. Then there was me. To them, I was the quiet satellite on the outskirts, barely visible unless I drifted too close to their stage lights. My parents, especially my mother, had perfected the art of polite indifference to my accomplishments. If Amber's new product launch was a standing ovation, my achievements got the slow clap, one or two pats before the conversation shifted back to center stage. The last Christmas before the country club incident had been a masterclass in the family dynamic. We were gathered in my parents' Dallas home, the air perfumed with cinnamon, pine, and the faint tension that always clung to holiday gatherings. The dining table was dressed to impress, china plates that hadn't seen daylight since the Reagan administration, polished silverware reflecting the golden light from the chandelier. Zach, standing at the head of the table like a politician at a campaign rally, raised his champagne glass. To closing our Series C round, he announced, his voice warm and just loud enough to carry over the clinking of cutlery. $25 million in funding secured. Next year's going to be big. The room erupted in applause. My father beamed as though he'd negotiated the deal himself. Mom's eyes shone with the fervor of a parishioner who'd just witnessed a miracle. Questions flew across the table, about expansion, investor relations, projected growth, each one an affirmation of Zach's place as the family's resident success story. I waited until the roar of approval ebbed, then quietly said, AI, actually got an award at work a couple weeks ago. Mom turned her serene, non-committal smile toward me. That's wonderful, dear. It's the Department of Defense's Exceptional Service Award, I continued, trying to keep my voice even. For leading a special. That's nice, Aded murmured, patting my hand without looking up, already angling his attention back to Zach. Across the table, Amber let out a dramatic sigh and fanned herself with her napkin. It's so hard to get excited about government paperwork, she said, her tone laced with mock sympathy. No offense. The conversation shifted back to Zach before I could reply. My words hung in the air for a second or two, then evaporated like breath on a cold day. I sat back and let the chatter wash over me. On the outside, I was the picture of calm. On the inside, I was replaying every moment in a mental ledger. The missed science fair because Amber had a recital, the college graduation they left early to drive Zach to the airport, the countless calls where my news was met with a polite "that's nice" before pivoting to Amber's latest triumph. They thought my career was some benign administrative role, a cubicle life of forms and data entry. They saw a stable paycheck, a pension, and a life that required neither curiosity nor courage. They didn't know the truth, that my desk job involved more threat matrices than memos, more secure briefings than spreadsheets, more weight on my shoulders than anyone in that room could imagine. In their language, success was measured in headlines and photo ops, in magazine spreads and social media likes. In my language, success was the absence of disaster, quiet victories that could never be shared outside secure rooms, the kind that left no visible trophy but saved lives all the same. And yet, year after year, I'd tried to translate. I'd tried to tell them in terms they could grasp. It never worked. They didn't speak that language, and they didn't want to learn. Sitting there that Christmas, watching them toast to yet another round of funding, I realized the truth. I'd spent too long waiting for respect in a currency they didn't value. And maybe it was time to stop trying to spend it on them at all. The world they thought I lived in, the one of neatly labeled folders, color-coded calendars, and endless coffee breaks, wasn't even in the same galaxy as the reality. My office wasn't some cubicle farm buried inside a federal building. It was a secured floor inside the Pentagon's intelligence wing, where every door required a badge and a code, and every hallway felt like a checkpoint between worlds. My title on paper was intentionally vague: Senior Strategic Operations Coordinator. In truth, I was the Deputy Director for Threat Analysis and Protective Intelligence, one of a handful of people in the country with the clearance and authority to quietly rewrite the security posture of an entire city if the situation called for it. They thought I was shuffling papers. I was, in fact, mapping risks to the most powerful decision-makers on Earth. On any given day, my job could pivot from an hours-long intelligence briefing on cyber intrusion attempts to a midnight conference call about a last-minute route change for a visiting head of state. Most people in my position avoided fieldwork. I didn't. I liked getting out there, seeing the terrain myself, because paper maps don't show you how a shadow falls at 3:15 p.m. or how the wind carries sound in an open plaza. That's where my forward fusion came in. In my world, we called it a ghost vehicle, ordinary to the point of invisibility. No tinted bulletproof SUV, no government plates to draw attention, just a middle-aged sedan that could sit on a side street for 6 hours without a single passerby remembering it was there. It wasn't a status symbol. It was a tool. A shield. My anonymity on 4 wheels. I remember one Tuesday in particular, just a few days after that Christmas, where my paperwork was dismissed over dessert. I was in a SCIF, Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, deep underground. The air was cool, the hum of secure servers constant in the background. We were running a red cell exercise for the Vice President's upcoming visit to a high-risk region. The scenario was simple on paper: evaluate vulnerabilities along the motorcade route. A senior agent with decades in the field insisted the primary threat came from a well-known extremist group. But my eyes were on the data feeds streaming across my screen, financial transfers spiking in an obscure border town, chatter on encrypted channels, the sudden purchase of specific agricultural chemicals. It didn't line up with the known group's behavior. The threat isn't from the north, I said, my voice calm but firm, tracing the chain of indicators on the digital map. It's coming from the west. If we don't alter the secondary route, we leave a 4-minute exposure window we can't defend. The agents started to argue, but my director, Colonel Marcus Danner, a grizzled, no-nonsense man who could stare down a hurricane, lifted a hand for silence. He studied my analysis for a long moment, eyes narrowing slightly as he followed the connections I'd drawn. Finally, he gave a single sharp nod. "Do it," he said. "Adjust the plan." And just like that, my assessment became the operational order. No applause. No champagne toast. Just the quiet knowledge that my voice had tipped the scale toward safety. That was my version of a Series C funding. I left that meeting with the same thing I'd had when I walked in, my unremarkable car keys in my pocket, my anonymity intact. And that's the point. In my world, the win is when no one outside the room even knows a change was made. If my family had been in that SCIF, they still wouldn't have understood. They'd have asked where the cameras were, where the recognition came in. They couldn't see that the absence of disaster was the recognition. For years, I tried to earn their respect in their own language, playing at status updates they might understand, softening the truth so it sounded more like what they valued. But the country club incident, with Amber's laugh still echoing in my ears, had flipped a switch. I wasn't going to translate anymore. If they didn't speak my language, I'd let them learn it the hard way. And I already knew exactly how the first lesson would play out. After the country club humiliation, I didn't vent to anyone. I didn't let it rattle me in meetings or distract me from my daily intel briefs. In my line of work, emotion was a liability, precision was survival. So I filed the incident away, not in a mental folder marked family drama, but in one labeled opportunity. Opportunities have a way of presenting themselves, sometimes too soon, sometimes just late enough for you to wonder if you imagine them. Mine arrived 3 months later with a soft ding in my inbox. Subject: Security Assessment Request. Location: Westlake Country Club, Austin, Texas. Event: Political fundraiser, Secretary of Energy attending. Applicant: Zachary Miller. The same Zach who had once introduced me at a wedding reception as the Amber's little sister. She works in, what, admin or something? It was a beautiful little twist of fate. Federal protocol requires that any event hosting a cabinet-level official go through an exhaustive security review. And the office that signs off on those reviews? Mine. I stared at the request, my hands still. The usual spike of irritation wasn't there. This wasn't about payback. Payback is messy, emotional, and short-sighted. This would be a surgical correction, a realignment of perspective, executed entirely within standard operating procedures. The plan wrote itself in 3 clean strokes. Step 1. Assign myself as the lead for the site survey. Perfectly permissible under our internal rules, and it would give me direct control over the scope, pace, and reporting of the assessment. Step 2. Schedule the final high-level security walkthrough for the evening of the club's annual charity gala. I knew Amber was chairing the event. I also knew it was her crown jewel, an evening she'd spent a year curating, right down to the arrangement of champagne flutes. Step 3. Ensure my boss, Colonel Danner, personally attended that walkthrough. His rank and presence would signal that this was no routine drop-in. The involvement of a cabinet secretary justified it, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the sight of real authority standing in your foyer can shift a room's entire gravity. The next morning, I walked into Danner's office with the file. He was at his desk, sleeves rolled, pen moving across a legal pad. I placed the folder down without ceremony. "Sir, the applicant for the Westlake event has some low-level flags," I began, flipping to the risk summary. "Minor irregularities in corporate filings, plus a few social connections that, while not disqualifying, could complicate protection protocols." I didn't mention Zach's name. I didn't mention Amber. I wasn't bringing family baggage into this. I was bringing facts. Danner studied me for a long moment over the rim of his glasses. He knew my service record. He also knew I never volunteered to lead a site review without good reason. Finally, he closed the folder, his thumb resting on the cover. "Your assessment is thorough," he said, his voice gravel low. "Clear my schedule for the final walkthrough. I'll attend myself." He leaned back slightly. "We'll use your vehicle for the low-profile approach." It was the faintest smile I'd seen from him in months, but it was enough. The green light had been given. The rest would unfold with the precision of a joint operation. Routes were planned. Access lists were finalized. Credentials were embedded in the club's own guest registry. They were expecting a cabinet-level guest. They were prepared for security. What they weren't prepared for was the lesson I was about to deliver, one in which the opening move would be my very ordinary Ford Fusion pulling up to their perfectly manicured front drive. The air outside the Westlake Country Club shimmered with late summer heat, the kind that made even expensive cologne hang heavy. From my vantage point a block away, I could see fairy lights strung through oak trees, the glint of glassware under the veranda canopy, and guests arriving in a steady parade of gleaming German sedans. The charity gala was in full swing, the perfect cover for what was. Officially, a high-level security walkthrough for an upcoming political fundraiser. My political fundraiser? No. Zach's. But my job tonight wasn't to clarify ownership. It was to assess threats. I eased the Ford Fusion into gear and rolled down the quiet side street toward the club entrance. At first, nothing about my arrival seemed to register with the valet crew. I was just another forgettable sedan among a fleet of high-status vehicles. The young man at the stand gave me the same professional half-smile he probably used for delivery vans. But before he could wave me toward some side lot, the sound of low, synchronized engines cut through the background chatter. Two black Chevrolet Suburbans glided in behind me, their paintwork so glossy it reflected the club's ornate facade in perfect detail. Diplomatic plates caught the light. Tinted windows hid their passengers from view. The valet's smile faltered. His eyes flicked from my car to the SUVs, confusion knitting his brow. This wasn't the sequence he was used to seeing. Suburbans didn't follow sedans. Unless, of course, the sedan was leading them. I shifted into park. The air conditioning hummed in the sudden stillness. Then I opened the driver's door and stepped out in a dark, tailored pantsart that, to the untrained eye, was simply businesslike. To the trained eye, it was the civilian uniform of someone who took their work, and their safety, seriously. The passenger door of my Fusion opened. Colonel Marcus Danner emerged, his silver hair cut to regulation precision, his presence commanding enough to ripple through the air without a word. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, scanned the perimeter with the ease of a man who'd spent decades evaluating threat vectors, and closed the car door behind him. In an instant, the valet crew straightened. Club security, stationed discreetly near the entrance, stepped forward as if pulled by an invisible wire. Conversations on the veranda hesitated mid-sentence. Amber was the first familiar face I spotted, breaking away from a group of guests in a shimmering emerald gown. She moved fast, her heels clicking like a metronome of irritation. She didn't even glance at Danner at first. Her focus was entirely on me, a laser beam of indignation. "Lexi," she hissed, voice low but edged with steel. "What is this? Who did you bring here? We have a strict guest list." Her manicured hand waved vaguely toward Danner. "You can't just show up with—" Before she could finish, Danner stepped forward, his voice calm, resonant, and carrying just enough authority to turn heads without raising it. I'm Colonel Marcus Danner. Your husband is expecting us. We're here for the final security walkthrough for his proposed event." Amber's mouth closed with an audible click. For a fraction of a second, her expression wavered between confusion and dawning recognition. She knew the name. She just couldn't reconcile it with the fact that he had stepped out of my car. The club manager appeared at her elbow, face pale. "Colonel, my apologies for any delay. Please, right this way." He motioned toward the main doors with the kind of deference you can't fake. Amber fell into step behind us, her gaze darting between Danner, the black Suburbans, and the very ordinary Fusion that was now parked directly in front of the grand entrance, a spot usually reserved for governors or foreign dignitaries. I caught her looking at it, the irritation rising in her posture. And I knew what she was about to do. She broke off from the group and marched toward my car, the set of her shoulders practically spelling out her intent to have it moved to where it belongs. But she stopped short at the rear bumper. Her head tilted. 7 plain characters stared back at her from the license plate, USG 00002. To her, it meant nothing. Just a strange, undecorated government plate. But the club's head of security, who had followed her, leaned in and murmured in a tone usually reserved for state secrets. That's the director's primary vehicle. USG 00001 is the president. USG 00002 is, he hesitated, the director of protective intelligence. Amber froze. Her shoulders stiffened. The irritation drained from her face, replaced by a mask of disbelief so pure it bordered on panic. Behind her, Danner turned toward me, his voice carrying just enough to be overheard by half the staff in earshot. "Director," he said evenly, "your initial assessment was correct. Deny the permit. This location is not secure." The head of security's eyes widened as he turned to look at me, not Danner, and Amber's expression collapsed entirely. She finally understood that their nanny car in front of the club wasn't here to drop off a catering assistant. It had arrived with the authority to shut her husband's ambitions down with a single sentence. And that's exactly what had just happened. The moment Colonel Danner's words left his mouth, the energy around us shifted. Club staff who had been standing tall and smiling seconds earlier now exchanged nervous glances. The head of security stepped back slightly, as though realizing he was in the presence of someone who could dismantle his entire evening's plan with a single phone call. Amber's eyes flicked from the license plate to my face, to Danner, and back again. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her mind as she tried to fit this impossible puzzle together. Her little sister, the boring admin in her world, had just been addressed, publicly, unmistakably, as director. The label didn't fit in the narrative she'd been telling herself for years, and it was tearing at the seams of her composure. "Director," as she repeated faintly, as though testing the word for cracks. "Of or what?" Danner didn't answer. He didn't need to. The question wasn't for him. The club manager, pale as linen, jumped in quickly. "Colonel, Director, Let us escort you to the main hall so we can begin the security review immediately. We'll clear the space as needed. He was already waving over staff to redirect foot traffic, murmuring instructions about closing off certain sections of the building. In less than a minute, the Garler's perfectly rehearsed choreography was unraveling under the weight of protocol. Amber was still rooted in place, her eyes following me as I walked past her toward the main doors. I didn't look back. In operations, you learn that sometimes the most effective statement is the one you don't make. Inside, the club was awash in warm light and the low hum of polite conversation. Waiters moved like clockwork, trays of champagne flutes balanced with precision. From somewhere deeper inside, a string quartet played a polished arrangement of Vivaldi. It was a scene designed for elegance, but tonight it felt more like a stage about to be shut down mid-performance. We moved through it at a steady, unhurried pace. Danner kept his focus on the security elements, the spacing between exits, the positioning of security cameras, the density of the crowd near the primary access routes. I did the same, noting choke points, escape paths, and potential vulnerabilities. I could feel eyes on us. Not the curious gaze of strangers trying to place a face, but the more cautious, sidelong glances of people sensing authority they didn't quite understand. When we reached the far side of the main hall, Danner paused. "You've seen enough?" I nodded once. "Enough." He turned toward the club manager. "We'll issue the official report tomorrow, but our preliminary finding is that this venue does not meet the necessary security requirements for the planned event. Pending Director Carter's final sign-off, the permit is denied." The manager's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. "Sir, perhaps if we—" "It's not about appearances," Danner said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "It's about risk. And right now, this location carries too much of it." He glanced at me, and I gave the faintest nod. It was over. When we stepped back outside, the night air felt heavier, like the atmosphere after a storm passes but before anyone dares speak about it. The Garler continued inside, but out here in the Valley Lane, something fundamental had shifted. Amber stood near the entrance, still in her emerald gown, but the proud, polished posture she'd worn all evening was gone. She looked smaller somehow, her eyes flicking toward the Fusion parked in that prime spot as though it might explain everything if she stared long enough. She took a half step toward me, her lips parting, but whatever words she'd meant to say didn't make it past her throat. Danner was already walking to the car. I followed without hesitation. The Suburbans fell into position behind us, their engines rumbling softly in the background. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the club without a single backward glance. From the corner of my eye, I saw Amber still standing there, her figure shrinking in the rearview mirror, framed by the golden light of the entrance she'd once ruled without question. Her expression was unreadable from this distance, but I didn't need to see it to know. The world she'd built on perception had just been introduced to a reality she never imagined existed. And the thing about reality is, it doesn't ask for your permission before it changes everything. The official reasoning for the permit denial was standard, almost boring in its precision. Venue layout presents unacceptable vulnerabilities for protective detail operations involving a cabinet-level principle. It was the kind of phrasing that would mean little to the average reader, but in certain political and business circles, it carried the same impact as a fire alarm. Within 48 hours, word began to ripple outward from Westlake's elite bubble. The much-hyped fundraiser Zach had been touting for months was abruptly cancelled. No graceful rescheduling, no polite cover story about a calendar conflicts. Just a blunt, final statement citing as security concerns as the cores. In their world, perception is currency, and the loss was catastrophic. Zach's reputation as an up-and-coming power player evaporated almost overnight. He had built his personal brand on the illusion of flawless execution, on being the man who could pull strings and open doors no one else could. Now the whispers painted him as unreliable, a risk, a man whose big event had been shut down by the very government circles he'd been trying to impress. Amber's standing suffered just as quickly. The charity gala she'd spent a year orchestrating was overshadowed by the visible presence of federal security that evening, and people noticed the way she'd been left standing outside as their director and the colonel walked in without her. It wasn't the kind of scene you could spin into glamour. Within a month, the invitations slowed. By the second month, they'd all but stopped. The couples who used to linger near Amber at club functions now drifted to other tables. Her closest social allies became conspicuously busy when she called. I didn't take pleasure in it, not in the way people expect when they hear a story like this. In my world, you're taught to separate satisfaction from outcome. This wasn't victory. It was the inevitable gravitational effect of arrogance colliding with reality. Still, the efficiency of it was hard to ignore. No screaming matches, no ugly public scenes, just a quiet, clinical adjustment of the hierarchy. By the end of that year, my own life had shifted, too. Colonel Danner retired, leaving behind a legacy of steel integrity and a long list of protégés who would have followed him anywhere. When the president signed off on the recommendation for his successor, the appointment landed on my desk. Acting Director, Office of Protective Intelligence, Department of Defense. The first time I walked into the Oval Office in that role, I felt the weight of it in my bones. The thick carpet with the presidential seal under my boots, the quiet gravity in the air, these weren't ceremonial details. They were reminders of the stakes. That day, I briefed the Commander-in-Chief on a developing overseas situation, outlining 3 possible scenarios and my recommended course of action. There were no cameras. No applause. No one to post it online. But the president listened, pen still, eyes locked on mine, and when I finished, he nodded once. Do it. That was it. That was the moment. Not Christmas dinners or country club galas. Not public recognition or social applause. Just the trust of the highest office in the nation when it mattered most. Meanwhile, back in Austin, Zach was still trying to repair his image. His LinkedIn posts had shifted from bold declarations to vague, overly polished reflections about resilience and change. Amber had pivoted to charity work, but without her usual high-profile platforms, the photos of her galas now looked smaller, dimmer. I didn't call. She didn't write. The silence wasn't hostile. It was simply complete. In our respective worlds, we'd both learned something. She'd learned that influence built solely on image can vanish in a single night. I'd been reminded that true authority is never about the spotlight. It's about the shadows, where the real decisions are made and where the people who matter will know exactly who you are, even if no one else ever will. It was late on a Tuesday when I arrived home, the city lights glimmering faintly through the tinted glass of my armored government sedan. My driver, a quiet, efficient agent who knew better than to make small talk unless invited, pulled smoothly up to the curb outside my building. The Ford Fusion was long gone by then, retired to a secure facility. I'd signed the transfer papers without ceremony, knowing it had done its job for over a decade. To most, it was just a well-worn mid-size sedan. To me, it had been both a shield and a statement, proof that in my world, blending in was sometimes the most powerful position you could take. I stepped inside my apartment and was greeted by the familiar hum of the air system. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you only notice after spending hours in rooms where every sound matters. I dropped my keys into the ceramic dish by the door and noticed the stack of mail on the console table. On top of the pile sat a single thick envelope. The handwriting on the front was immediately recognizable. Amber's looping, dramatic script. For a moment, I simply looked at it, my fingertips resting on the paper. It was heavier than a casual note. Inside, I imagined, would be pages of explanation, some combination of apologies, justifications, and maybe even a plea for a reset. I could almost hear her voice trying to smooth it over, to rewrite the country club incident into something harmless, a misunderstanding between sisters. I carried the envelope into the living room and placed it on the polished surface of my side table. The lamplight caught the curve of the ink in my name. I sat for a while, gazing at it from across the room, not touching it again. In the past, I might have torn it open immediately, scanning every line for some trace of validation, some acknowledgement that she had finally seen me for who I was. But the truth was, I no longer needed it. Whatever that letter contained, apology, excuse, or silence between the lines, it couldn't change anything. My peace didn't hinge on her understanding anymore. It hadn't for a long time. I turned away from the table and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside to look down at the city. The lights were scattered like constellations, each one part of a network that never slept. Somewhere out there, my teams were working, running threat assessments, analyzing chatter, quietly shaping the safety of people who would never know their names. That was my world now. My family wasn't bound by last names or shared history. It was bound by service, discipline, and the unspoken respect between those who carry a weight most can't see. I thought about something Colonel Danner had told me once, back when I was still learning to balance the operational with the political. Rank doesn't mean a damn thing if you need to announce it. If you're doing it right, the people who matter already know. He'd been right. The people who mattered knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. And the people who didn't? They could keep guessing. Behind me, the envelope sat untouched, the ink on the front still catching the light. I didn't need to open it. My life didn't run on her approval anymore. I watched the skyline for a long while, letting the quiet fill the room. Somewhere below, a siren wailed briefly and then faded. The city's heartbeat kept on, steady and unbroken. In the reflection on the glass, I caught a glimpse of myself, calm, steady, no need to explain. And for the first time in years, I realized I wasn't carrying any of the old weight. Amber had once believed worth was something you could park in the driveway for everyone to see. I knew better now. True worth was in the silent work, the unseen protection, the victories that leave no mark except the absence of disaster. And in the end, the only people who need to see it or always do.